After sent to repent at the temple of King Eurystheus, Hercules cements his status and earns his place in legend by performing a series of so-called labors. The king sought to shame him, to humiliate him with repeated failures, but the hero triumphs over every obstacle, defeats every enemy, completes every task, and succeeds in ascending to the peak of Mount Olympus. First, he strangles the Nemean lion, a creature with an impenetrable hide. Second, he slays the Lernaean hydra by cauterizing its necks in a bid to stop new heads from developing. Third, after tracking it for a year, he captures the Ceryneian hind, which could race at a stride that would outpace an arrow. Fourth, he seized the Amanthium boar by cornering it in a mound of thick snow. Fifth, he dug two deep trenches to lead two raging rivers through the Augean stables to clean decades of manure in a single day. Sixth, he shot down the carnivorous Omphalian bird. Seventh, he detained the colossal Cretan bull. Eighth, he stole the elusive mares of Diomedes. Ninth, he recovered the belt of Hippolyta from the Amazonian queen. And finally, he stole the magical cattle of the three-bodied giant Geryon. But the king was unsatisfied, was displeased, and ruled that two of his feats failed to count on account of the help that he had received. So he set him two more tasks to complete, taking golden apples from the Hesperides nymphs and capturing Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades that stood guard over the river Styx. So with wit and ingenuity, with cunning and with skill, Hercules got the apples and the hound and eventually found his way to Mount Olympus. But if we turn from Athens and Rome to Jerusalem, we find our first forefather facing 10 tests of his own. As our sages say in the Ethics of the Fathers in Pirkei Avot, Asara nisnoyot nasa Avraham Avinu. Avraham faced 10 tests, va'amad b'chulam, and he withstood them all. And though the inventory of these 10 tests differs depending on where you look, the Midrash Maimonides, the Meiri, Rabbeinu Yonah, or Rabbeinu Tam, they all amount to an astonishing list of hurdles overcome. His faith was tried in flames and hardened in the rage of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite kings. His commitment was tested in conflict and in undergoing circumcision. His conviction was assessed in the act of banishing one son and the willingness to kill the other. And after these trials that had loomed over his life, he was forced to beg to purchase a plot to bury his wife. So we have two great civilizations, Athens and Jerusalem, and two great heroes who were tried but ultimately triumphed, becoming paradigms of perseverance and grit for posterity. But that is where the parallel ends, because in one major way, the tests faced by Hercules and Avraham differ and consequently infuse our imaginations with opposing traits, and that difference is the enemies that the heroes faced. Hercules occupies a world of beasts and fights mythic creatures, lions, serpents, bulls, birds, and boars. His heroism is found in the capacity to ground fiends, bind hounds, and seize hinds. All his enemies are external, and his inner world remains static and unseen. But in contrast, the drama of the Abrahamic labors unfolds not on the world's stage, but in the theater of the soul. All the monsters that Abraham faces are found within. His enemies are not the creatures of myth, but the beasts that live in the human heart: doubt, apathy, greed, fear, impatience. In only one of the many tests found on the multiplicity of lists does Abraham fight anybody else, the war of the four kings. And in that war, the real resistance that he must overcome is not the opposing armies, but the instinct to walk away. Where Hercules must exhibit the skill and the strength and the brawn to better monsters belonging to the Titans, Abraham is challenged to battle his own demons, to conquer all the temperamental impediments to devotion and attention and sensitivity and philanthropy and allegiance. Hercules wrestles for his own sake. Abraham wrestles for the sake of his faith. Hercules fought on earth so that he could join the gods on Mount Olympus. Avram climbed Mount Moriah so that he could bring God down to earth. Hercules strives to show his love of power. Abraham strives to show the power of love. In the words of the sages in that same Mishnah, where they said, Asaranis noyot nisnasa Avram Avinu, that Avram faced 10 trials, they add some key words as to the purpose of the trials. Lahudia, to show, kama chibato shel Avram Avinu, how much Avraham loved. Central to our faith, as manifest in our first forefather, is the internalization of conflict, the recognition that the most difficult and important enemies for us to overcome are not out there, but in here. Unlike the ancient Greeks, our tradition teaches that our central task is not to master the other and love the self, but to master the self and love the other. Pithily put by our sages, Ezahu Gibor, who is the hero? Hakovesh et Yitzro, the one that conquers himself. Or as Rabbi Natan puts it, Ezahu Gibor, who is the hero? Misha Oses Sona O Ahavo, one who turns an enemy into a friend. And we know that after 10 trials that define the decades of his life, that took him from his father's home in a bustling city to a desert tent in a quiet valley, Avraham internalized conflict and recognized the dangers of the most powerful monster within, narcissism. As he turns to the future and he sends his servant to find his son a wife, he says, Va'azbiacha, I make you swear, my servant. Lo tikach isha livni, do not take a wife for my son, mibnot ha'kna'ani, from the Canaanite daughters, asher anochi yoshev b'kivo, among whom I dwell. And all the commentators wonder why Avram is so insistent on his future daughter-in-law not coming from Canaan. Because despite his unequivocal insistence, he never gives a reason. Some suggest that Avram's choice was motivated by theopolitical reasons, to avoid the perception that his people acquired the land through natural inheritance rather than supernatural bequest. Some suggest that his choice was motivated by a wish to keep his family close to home, knowing that having in-laws abroad would make Yitzchak and his grandchildren's visits infrequent and brief. But there is one suggestion that insists that if we look a little more closely at the text, Avram does in fact disclose his motivation. He says, Lo tikach isha livni, do not take a wife for my son, mibnot ha'kna'ani, from the Canaanite women, asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo, which I dwell among. And Reb Nachum Sachs reminds us that we already know quite well where Avraham dwells, so why on earth would he need to tell his servant, or does the text need to tell us that he lives in Canaan? And Rabbi Sachs suggests that neither Avram nor the text is doing any such thing. When he says, do not take a Canaanite daughter, asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo, it does not mean in which I dwell, but asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo, in which the I dwells. In his words, asher anochiyut, the egoism yoshvim bo, the place that is suffused with vanity and conceit, with egotism. When Avram directs his servant to find a wife for his son to ensure the future of the nation he is in the midst of founding, he sends him away from a place that is immersed in myth-induced narcissism, so that the legacy for which he has fought, a faith in which we control ourselves and love the other, lives on in his children and their children and becomes the mark of the nation. And due to that decision, it does. As one of the medieval masters puts it, Yisrael Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanin heim. The Jewish people come from and continue to form a legacy of sympathy, mercy, care, and compassion. So as we may admire the strength and the adventures of the Greek heroes and speak of Herculean feats, let us draw our inspiration from the less vivid but far more vital Abrahamic trials and the legacy that his triumphs leave at our feet. That we succeed when we control the self and love the other. I wish you all a Shabbat of peace. Shabbat Shalom.